Hi, welcome to the fourth installment in my series, Reading Literature, an Introduction. In this video, I'm continuing the topic that I was discussing in the previous installment, where I'm doing a survey of the history of Western literature. The purpose of this is to provide a guide to some of the broad categories of literature that are out there, so that people who are new to the field or newer to the field can more easily find things that will interest them and can more easily access things that are similar to literary works that they've already liked. This is part of the goal of the overall series of providing a introductory course on the practice of reading literature to people who are not highly knowledgeable or accustomed to the field. So where we left off in the previous video was towards the end of the 18th century, and I wanted to continue from there to basically the present. Uh, Last time I talked about the early modern period as this time lasting from around 1400 to the late 1700s, and I purposely didn't place an exact date as an endpoint there. And today, the bulk of my time I want to spend on the 19th century, but I'm going to be using a concept that sometimes historians or literary scholars use that is called the long 19th century. And put simply, that's just a way of sort of talking about the cultural world of the 19th century without limiting it to specifically the years 1800 to 1899. Because if you look at the history and the events and the culture of the West during that time, the cultural 19th century begins somewhat before 1800 and it continues until about World War I. So the long 19th century concept will enable us to include some literature that was from the late 1700s and some that's from the early 1900s under this concept of the long 19th century, because there's similarities between those works and the works that were in the 19th century proper. Now, the 19th century, I think, is the most fascinating period to study in Western literature. And that's only partly just a matter of preference, because I think it is very clear that this is the period when we have the most fertile development of great and well-renowned works of literature in the West. There is just the full blossoming of the novel and a vast array of different works that are regarded today as greats. And there's still all sorts of plays, poetry. It's a really artistically rich period. And I think it's not just literature. I think the 19th century in general was a great period for the arts, and I think it was a fascinating and busy time for human culture as a whole. A lot was happening during the 19th century, a lot of revolutions, a lot of technological advances, a lot of change, a lot of really exciting things. And a lot of that historical background does show up in the literature of the period. So it's a good way, if you're just interested in the history, you can see these works that are written during the time, often set during the time, and it can be a really, really fascinating experience. Now, in talking about the long 19th century, I'm going to basically divide my discussion into two parts, based not strictly on time period, but based on the main two types of literature that we see in the 19th century. And I want to stress before I talk about this division that this isn't a totally binary case. It's sort of two ends of a spectrum, a lot of works being sort of in the middle or mostly one but part the other, a foot in both camps. But I think it's a good way to sort of divide works from this period into two types. And I think it's particularly useful even for somebody who's relatively new to literature, because what I find is that people who like a work in one of these types tend to prefer other works from that type, and same with the other one. It seems like there are deep similarities between works within these categories, and people tend to prefer one or the other to a pretty significant degree. So the two types I'm going to talk about are called Romanticism and Naturalism. And first I'm going to go into Romanticism because chronologically it is the earlier development. Now, Romanticism, it's worth pointing out, does not mean romance. It's not equivalent to like stories about love. It's more a description of the type of story that the writer creates in the novel, and they can be about any number of different subjects, and they don't have to have any love stories in them at all. Romanticism is really defined by a focus on characters' choices in laying out the plot of a story. In a romantic story, a novel, play, whatever, in a romantic story, the emphasis is on what people choose to do, what people choose to seek, what people choose to act in the pursuit of, and these choices are what determines the outcome of the plot. And as a result of this emphasis on choice, and obviously you want to make your plot interesting, so you want to have interesting choices, interesting dilemmas, interesting conflicts between people who choose different things, romantic writers tend to prioritize what kind of interesting choices can I make, what kind of interesting dilemmas, what kind of interesting plots, over the question of, is this a realistic story? Is this a story that is likely to resemble what happens in real life? So what we're really looking at in Romanticism is not just a recreation of reality in the sense of this looks a lot like real things that you might see every day, but a recreation of reality sort of in a deeper sense, a recreation of some of the important clashes of ideas or clashes of values that people face in their lives, even if it's dramatized in a scenario that is not likely to be encountered by the ordinary person. Romanticism, in a certain way, can be compared to ancient Greek literature. It's certainly the one that is most similar to Romanticism. A lot of romantic stories have really admirable heroes who are held up as examples, and in that way, a lot of romantic literature is sort of like the Greek heroism, with some of the tragic element that I talked about also being part of ancient Greek literature played down or pared back. Now, Romanticism is primarily seen in novels and plays. The novel, as we talked about last time, is sort of a new development. It starts coming into popularity towards the end of the early modern period, but with Romanticism, it starts to take over. It starts to become one of the dominant forms of literature. Most, I think, of the highest, greatest works in Romanticism are novels, and there are a lot of writers to choose from in this category. So this list that I name will certainly not be anything close to an exhaustive list of the great romantic novelists. Just a few to call out first. I think that probably the best known to English-speaking readers is Charles Dickens. He is one of the romanticists that's a little bit more on the realistic side. His plots are not usually that far-fetched, which is not always the case with Romanticism. But again, the romantic writer would say that's not the point. The point isn't to be whether you're realistic or not. The point is how good and how significant are the conflicts in your story. Dickens, of course, is one of the most famous English writers. He's probably still the most famous after Shakespeare. And he writes really interesting, really compelling plots. It seems almost like he does so effortlessly. They have the splash of romanticism, the drama of heightened choices. And he might be a good place to go for somebody who's, interested in romanticism but tends to object when something isn't super realistic. Dickens might be a place to go there. French novelists, there was a lot of great romantic novelists in France. Victor Hugo is, I think, the standout French romanticist, and I think one of the standout romanticists overall. He's top two for sure. He has a lot of very meaningful, spiritual, intellectual drama in his stories. And Hugo is certainly not limited to just Notre Dame and Les Miserables. He's got 5 novels, and as I'll talk about a bit later, he's got plays as well. His novels are really, I think, packed with meaning and drama. So he's one I highly recommend. Someone who's a little less philosophical than the previous two, but is a really great writer of exciting plots, is Alexandre Dumas. There are 2 of them. There's a father and a son. I'm talking specifically about the father, who wrote The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, a number of other novels. He was very prolific. And these are just really exciting plot novels that have some meaning to them. They're not as philosophically deep as some others, but he's certainly a great writer, an exciting romantic, and is maybe a good place for someone who's kind of new to this style of writing to begin. I will also mention one more who maybe isn't associated with Romanticism by people, but I think does belong in the category, and that's Fyodor Dostoevsky, one of the great Russian novelists. He, unlike the writers I mentioned before, he does not really show heroes. He doesn't have many characters who are particularly admirable or held up as any sort of example. That's different, certainly, from someone like Hugo and from a lot of other romantic writers. Nonetheless, his novels do have the romantic approach to plot. The consequences of characters' decisions is what drives the stories. And even though the characters are not necessarily making admirable decisions, it's still a romantic type story if what matters is their decisions. And in Dostoevsky, we can see the consequences of people making some often very poor decisions. Dostoevsky, of the writers I mentioned here, is definitely the most philosophical, and people find him fascinating for that reason, and some people find him intimidating for that reason. He's a little harder than some of these other novelists, but I think he's really worth it, and he will really make you think. So those are the kind of a few of the big names in romantic novels. There are also romantic plays. Plays are second string to novels in the romantic world, but there's still a lot of very good ones. Like I said, Hugo wrote a number of plays. Dumas also was a playwright. Another person I would mention is Friedrich Schiller, who started writing in the 18th century, so he's kind of fitting into that long 19th century category. But he wrote a number of very dramatic, romantic plays. Another one specific work that is, I think, one of the great romantic plays, one of the most memorable ones, is Cyrano de Bergerac by Edmond Rostand. This play is, I think, one of the hallmarks of romantic literature, and definitely something that everyone should experience. I will also mention, before moving on to naturalism, that there is a huge wealth of great English poetry from the long 19th century. There are so many major poets from that period. Poetry is a little bit harder to categorize as romantic or naturalist because a lot of poetry doesn't really have a plot. It's, a scene, a feeling, a thought, but not a story necessarily. But a lot of the great poetry from the 19th century in English, it has a certain kinship with the romantic novels and plays. There's a similar attitude towards life that comes out of those poets. And again, there are too many to mention all of them, but certainly some of the big names would be William Wordsworth, John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Alfred Lord Tennyson, Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and there are many others. Now let's turn from Romanticism to naturalism, which I said it's historically the later development. There's not a strict divide. It's not like, it's 1860, time to switch to naturalism. But naturalism does start to rise in the mid-19th century and becomes the dominant literary form in the late part of the 19th century. Now, how do we distinguish Romanticism and Naturalism? Well, like I said, Romanticism is about plots that are determined by characters' choices, the decisions they make. Naturalism de-emphasizes the role of choice, or sometimes even eliminates it. Some naturalists outright basically deny that their characters make any sort of conscious choices at all, and others show them as maybe having some limited choices, but to a large degree being driven by other factors. What are these other factors? What do naturalist characters act on if not their choices? Well, naturalist characters tend to be affected by either innate emotions, instincts, intuitions that push them in one direction or another for reasons that they don't necessarily consciously comprehend, or external social pressures that mold them into certain types of people and push them to make certain types of action, or some combination of the two, internal emotions influenced by external social pressures. Naturalists, then, they're not interested so much in showing interesting, exciting philosophical choices that people make. That's not the type of reality recreation they're engaged in. They're not engaged in the recreation of choices that have some sort of philosophical significance, but maybe divorced from average, ordinary life. Naturalists are concerned with ordinary, average life, typically. Their goal is to show what people, everyday people, the people that inhabit the majority of society, are typically like. And so in naturalist novels, you tend to see ordinary, average characters in situations that are fairly typical, common, expected in the course of life, given a certain time and place, a certain setting. Now, naturalism is definitely, there are certainly naturalist plays, but naturalism is, by the time of the naturalist rise, the novel had really, really come to the forefront of literature in the Western world. And so many of the, I'd say most of the most famous, the most highly regarded naturalistic works are novels. And again, there are a lot of writers, too many to go through comprehensively. A few to mention: Émile Zola is the creator of naturalism. He's the first person to formulate it as a theory. He's French, and another French writer is Honoré de Balzac, who wrote this series of books that he called The Human Comedy that tried to show different aspects of French life during his period, which goes to show the kind of project that naturalists are engaged in. They're trying to show what is human life like, what are people really like, how do they really live. And then perhaps the biggest name in naturalism, and one of the biggest names in world literature, is Leo Tolstoy, the Russian novelist. He wrote a couple of very long, very famous novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina. These are among the most famous, most highly regarded, greatest works of naturalism. But you don't have to dedicate 900 or 1,300 pages to experience Tolstoy, because he has a lot of short novellas that still give you a sense of his approach to literature and his view of human life. So that sort of sums up the 19th century in the two major schools of that time. And again, a lot of writers aren't purely one or purely the other. They often will have a bit of a foot in both camps. I would say, I mean, for example, Dickens, I mentioned among the Romantics, I think that is his dominant mode, but he has some elements of naturalism too. For example, in his interest in depicting ordinary characters and typical average situations of life, which he combines with some of his more structured, invented plots. So again, these aren't like, it's not A or B, it's a spectrum. And we're looking at what the defined ends of the spectrum are, and a lot of writers fall somewhere in the middle. But if you, as I said, if you typically like one type, you will probably like other writers in that type. If you really like, Balzac, you probably will do well with Tolstoy. If you really like Dickens, you will probably like Hugo. It's that type of thing. So now to move on and do a very brief discussion of the 20th century. I don't want to spend too much time on the 20th century because, first of all, I think it needs much less of an introduction to the typical viewer of this video. 20th century literature is obviously, it's much closer to our time period, and it's written for people who are more like modern people. There's not a lot of sort of historical backgrounding that you have to do in order to get into a 20th century novel. Also, I think it doesn't need as much time because there's not as much of a distinct 20th century style that is worth approaching for the type of person I'm making this video for. Many, many, many 20th century works are basically continuations of one of the two styles from the 19th century, mostly naturalism. So naturalism, as I said, became dominant towards the end of the 19th century, and it basically continues its dominance through the 20th century. And so most of the novels and plays of the 20th century are basically sort of a continuation of 19th century naturalism. There are a few works that have, as to a greater or lesser degree, a romantic element in them. Most notably, I mentioned in an earlier video at Ayn Rand. She's kind of the most throwback to 19th century romanticism of the 20th century novelist, but she's definitely an exception in her era. Most of her contemporaries are naturalists, and she's certainly not well regarded by many of those contemporaries, in part because they have very distinct approaches to literature. But a lot of the famous 20th century writers of the West, Hemingway, George Orwell, these F. Scott Fitzgerald, these writers are definitely a continuation of naturalism. Now, there is a new literary movement that comes to be in the 20th century, but I don't give it as much attention as the other ones I've talked about because I don't think it is, frankly, a literarily meritorious movement. I think it's basically an anti-literature movement, and that's called modernism. And some people talk about postmodernism. That's basically just a continuation of modernism. Modernism it's sort of a broad heading, and there are some things that are called modernism that I wouldn't really consider modernist in the bad way. But basically, modernism is this movement that comes in literature and basically all the arts around the time of World War I, especially after World War I. And it's a move towards basically prioritizing artistic form without content, and deliberately without content. So in painting, you get an emphasis on colors and patterns without painting actual recognizable objects. In sculpture, you get these shapes without them actually depicting any real entities. And in literature, you get an emphasis on style, basically, the interesting combinations of words, catchy descriptions, alliteration, any other sort of things that might be seen as stylistically good without much of an interest in story. There can be a story there, but it's not what the writer regards as important. It's usually not a particularly interesting story, and what the modernist writer wants you to be reading for is the style. Now, as a consequence, modernism can often descend into just being basically incoherent. At its better side, it's not incoherent, but it's sort of confusing, I think deliberately so, and uninteresting, I think. Why I say this is not a literarily meritorious form and why I don't recommend it for anyone at all, really, but especially not for people who are new to literature, is that I think it's defeating the purpose of literature. Like I said back in the first video, art is a selective recreation of reality. Now, it's selective and it's done in a certain way, so style is an important part of art, but you can't have a style, or you shouldn't have a style without it being a style of doing something. It's a perversion of the purpose of art, which is to recreate reality. If you say, I'm going to create and not create a thing, not recreate reality, you have something that is perhaps an interesting curiosity, but isn't really art and doesn't provide all of the benefits of art that I talked about in the first video. I talked about, you get an artist's view of the world. You get this magnifying glass to different aspects of human experience. Modernism really starts to move away from that, and in its worst forms completely loses it. The things you can get from the better modernists, you can get from the naturalists just fine, and then you don't have to, deal with the needless complications of modernism itself. Now, for the previous periods, I've been putting selected authors up. I'm not going to do that for the 20th century. I've mentioned a few authors who are representative of continuations of Romanticism and naturalism into the 20th century, but there's such a wide range of authors in the 20th century, and most of the major ones are well enough known to a modern audience that I don't really want to put together a selected list. So that brings us through literary history to the present day. Hopefully dividing it into these loose periods, ancient Greek, Roman, medieval, early modern, 19th century, both romantic and naturalist, and 20th century, helps you sort of get a clearer sense of the broad literary history of the Western world, break it down into categories. And hopefully it will help you find other works that you're interested in by seeing, oh, what else came from the same period? I would probably like, I liked Euripides, so maybe I'll read some other Greeks, or I liked Tolstoy, so I'll read some other 19th century naturalists. So I really hope that this was beneficial for you and helps you understand what is a pretty complex issue in much simpler terms. In the next video, I'm going to get more specific and enumerate some specific literary works that I think are good places to begin for someone who is not highly versed in literature. So look forward to that. If you still are listening to this breakdown of historical periods and thinking, okay, that makes some sense, but I still don't know quite where to start. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you liked and subscribed to the channel. And if you really liked it, by all means, feel free to share it with others. Thanks, and see you next time.